My name is Joseph Bogart. I'm the Executive Director of the Save Our Wild Salmon Coalition. I'm one of the, thanks. Save Our Wild Salmon is one of the sponsoring NGOs for this event, and I'll introduce the others in a moment. We have a pretty packed agenda, so I'll try to be brief. I think I first want to thank the Burke for hosting us. It's a beautiful facility, and the team has been really great to work with. I want to put a special shout out to the sponsors and hosts of the reception. Duke's Seafood and Chowder, thank you. And Bill and Patricio, thank you for serving the food, it's excellent. Benziger Family Winery, hosted with the wine. And Fremont Brewing Company with the beer. Wonderful businesses and excellent foods. So really glad to partner with them. And then I want to quickly thank the fellow sponsoring organizations. There's sort of a long list. It's been great working with you all. And I have this cheat sheet here in case I might forget any of them. American Whitewater. Tom O'Keefe is around somewhere. Tom O'Keefe is in back. With his mom, Martha, is here too. Wendy McDermott from American Rivers. In back over there. Bill Arthur and Alex Craven from the Sierra Club in back. Thank you guys. Rob Kreibel and Vanessa Lopez from Defenders of Wildlife. Tom France and friends from National Wildlife Federation. Another organization from the east side of the state, and actually the inland northwest, including Idaho, is Nimipu Protecting the Environment. They're a conservation nonprofit that's been started in the last few years, led by Nez Perce members, and they've been great partners in the last few years, and we really enjoy working with them. Glad they could be here as sponsors. Mountaineers Books. Which makes me think there are the book on the Elwha by Linda Mapes and Steve Ringman, who I think might be here with his wife Evelyn, is for sale in back for $25. Proceeds from that will help offset expenses associated with hosting this event. So, it's a fantastic book. If you haven't seen it already, it's something to definitely look at, and I encourage you to grab it. It's a beautiful book telling a beautiful story. Northwest Energy Coalition, Kat Plimpton's here. Thanks, Kat. The Wild Steelhead Coalition has a number of representatives here too. Earth Justice, Linda Maxon, Steve Mashuda. So, hopefully I haven't forgotten anybody. I also want to give a quick shout out to a number of representatives of congressional offices that are joining us here this evening, which we're very appreciative of. Sean Bill's in back with Senator Murray's office. Tommy Bauer from Senator Cantwell's office. And I think Christine Nahn from Adam Smith's office may still be here. So thank you all for being here. We're very appreciative of being here and the leadership on the part of your offices at this particular time. What I'd like to do now is I have the great honor of introducing Ken Workman of the Duwamish tribe. He is the great, 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 great grandson of Chief Seattle. And thank you for being here, Ken. And we're here on Duwamish land, and he is here to start this event off, this evening off, with a Duwamish welcome. So thank you all for being here. I should have said that too. And Ken, thanks for being here to help.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Yayustobes is my native name. Workman is my English name. And so by way of formal introduction, this is how we would do it not too very long ago, just 170 or so years, when there was nothing here but trees and a handful of Duwamish people. So Yayustobes Tidzda, my name is Workman. Hata Duwabs the Ishidchad, and I am of the Duwamish tribe. Aquayekwa, Siab Sialchad, and great grandson of Chief Seattle. And we say this introduction like this because people would come to this land in canoes, and there would be hills, and there would be trees, and there would be streams and landmarks, but they would wonder, where are they? And so somebody like my grandfather, Chief Seattle, would run out on the shore, and he'd say, oh, this is the land of the Duwamish. Duwabs, it means inside people. And then he would say, my name is, in my case, Yayustobs, and we would go through family names and just keep going and going and going until we started seeing heads nod. Oh, I know who your grandparents are, or your great-grandparents, or your father. So I just cut to the chase and go, oh. So Aquayekwa means great, and it's easier to say in the Lushootseed. So it wasn't very long ago that he stood over here on the shore, and he said to people, come here to this land, this place called Zidzalalich was the original Indian village, and Duwamish River. But come here to this land. And so he would say something like, land your canoe, bring your canoe ashore, onto this land of the Duwamish. You are welcome here. Gui means invite. And so when we say Gwigwi Hidak, it means welcome everybody. And so it wasn't too very long ago that people from the north, they would come down here, and we were warring tribes and all that stuff. But we're friends now. And so we like to include everybody when we welcome people onto this land, because believe it or not, for a long, long time, thousands of years, we've been saying words very much like this, and we continue to do that today. We say things like, we express thank you to our Tlingit friends from Alaska. And the way they say thank you is Gunolchish. So when our Tlingit friends come here and they hear their word, they go, oh, okay, these people know me. This must be a good place. And so if you come south a little bit, 350 miles or so, you run into the Haida. And they use Hawa for that word. Hawa. And their neighbors, the Simsians, they use Deutschem, is the word that they use for thank you. A little bit south of that on Vancouver Island, you run into the Nuu-chah-nulth, and they use Tliko, the Makah, the Nuu-chah-nulth, they use this word. And so when they hear this word, they go, oh, this must be a good place, this land of the Duwamish. And so right here, well, just a little bit north, we have the Tulalip. And the Tulalip are a whole bunch of tribes. They're on this place called the Tulalip Reservation. And they use Tig. And so now we begin to run into more people. And so when you hear them say, oh, Tig weed seed, they're saying, oh, I thank you. Seed means you. Tig means thanks. Right here in the Seattle area, the Suquamish, the Puyallup, the Snoqualmie, the Muckleshoot, the Duwamish, we use Kwi. So when we say Esquididif Chat to Siaya, well, Kwi. We use Kwi, and it means the same thing. And our friends down on the Columbia River, the Chinook, they use Masi, Hayo Masi. And so this is an invitation to everybody. And this is what Grandpa did. When people came over here just a little while ago, when there was nothing here but trees and a river and some deer running around, maybe a bear or two, and he would say something like, Gwigwi Hidakti Siyaya Adisha Olgwada Fatatuabs. And that's Gwigwi Hidak, welcome to Siyaya. Friends, all friends, Adisha Olgwada, this specific land of the Duwamish people. And so it's with great honor that we're able to repeat these words here before you today. And that on this land, the old people still live, the ancient ones, the Yayalab. This means the relatives that have passed. And so we have stories when the ice went away. So that's 16,000 years worth of those people that have lived and died here. And so for us, all of our ancestors, they continue to live on this land and down in the ground. And so from all of them to all of you, we say, Gwigwi Hidakti Siyaya Adisha Olgwada. Simply means thank you and welcome everybody. But before I finish, I would also like to introduce Jesse Nightwalker, Chief Jesse Nightwalker of the Snake River Palouse, who has offered a prayer on this land, and he has people that are buried on this land as well. So when we talk about Salistolak, 2 rivers, this thing that we're here today, we talk about the Snake, we talk about the Elwha, and here we are right in the middle in Seattle. So Jesse, if you will. Wait.
I want to thank each and every one of you for taking the time out to sit there and be a part of this, about the removal of these dams, and everything like that, and all the hard work that goes into this, and how we were wrongfully removed on the Snake River, and how our people, the Palouse, and how our ancestors were removed. And I was just given notice of this yesterday. And so, I didn't know. I've been an activist for over a year now. I've done a lot of solidarity. I've done a lot of marches, especially with Ken here. We've done a lot of work within the last year. And with that I just wanted to say thank you. And I wanted to sing a song and say a prayer real quick, because I still have ancestors that are inside this building as we speak, that were removed off of the Snake River, that we need returned home on the Snake River. We still have ancestors that are still on this earth, that are over in Europe, that were removed off of the Snake River, that we still need back. They need a rightful place to be. They need a proper burial. They need to be returned home on the Snake River to where our ancestors, and who I'm named after. I'm sorry, Wanak Shash Chawawatiak, Shiapomamiki, Charlton Jess Chapman Nightwalker, Atwa Allah Hemshtinik, Atwa Allah Shiapomamiki, Mary Jim. That's what my grandmother is. And I just wanted to sing this song real quick.
I now have the pleasure of introducing our facilitator for the evening, Jeff Renner, formerly of King 5, meteorologist and author, has graciously agreed to help steer the conversation this evening. He claims he's retired, but I haven't seen any evidence of that. And it really is wonderful of you to take time to be here tonight. So thank you very much, Jeff. And without further ado.
As author Timothy Egan wrote, "The secret of life in the Northwest runs in packs of silver. In the Northwest, a river without salmon is a body without a soul." And I think most of us would agree with that. Salmon were called the king of fish first by Isaac Walton in The Complete Angler in 1653, and no, I was not around to interview him at that time. The history of Pacific salmon extends well beyond old Isaac. Genetic sequencing and analysis shows that they diverged from Atlantic salmon 20 million years ago. They were here and a presence, a part of this Northwest, even as it was evolving. If you know where to look, you can actually find some skeletons, some fossils of ancient salmon. And the person that told me that was a University of Washington scientist by the name of David Montgomery. He wrote an excellent book, by the way, The King of Fish. He points out that humans have conducted 3 major experiments to see how well salmon can adapt to changes in the landscape, in the landforms, in their overall environment. They failed the first in Great Britain. They failed the second in New England. The third one, well, that's up to all of us, and that's why we're here tonight. It's that issue that brings us together that is the subject of tonight, and we have 2 very able, very gifted, and insightful guides, and I'm pleased to be able to be here with them and in some way help this conversation go forward. I'm delighted to again have the opportunity to collaborate with a friend whose work I've admired for many years. Linda Mapes reports on the environment, natural history, and Native American tribal affairs for the Seattle Times. She describes herself not only as a reporter, but also as an explorer of the natural world, one who engages all 5 senses, but also a 6th, and that is the sense of wonder. And that's a critical sense to bring to this discussion and to any analysis of what's going on in the world around us. That gift gift of wonder, that sense of wonder, and that combination has been a gift to all of her readers, and I'm one of them, and has led to one acclaimed book after another. Her most recent, Witness Tree, was the fruit of a Knight Fellowship in Science Journalism at MIT. It's a thoughtful blend of climate science, of natural history, and a poetic treatment of the interaction between humankind and the landscape we inhabit. She has also done a great deal of work, and actually my first contact with Linda was as a result of her work covering the Elwha, what we'll talk about on the Elwha, and its subsequent transformation. She wrote a book documenting that process that's on the back table there, by the way, Elwha, A River Reborn. You can see where her knowledge and perspective will be invaluable tonight. So Linda, I'd invite you to come up and take the center seat if you would. Our second guest has spent decades covering salmon and the interests impacting their present health as well as their future. Rocky Barker is the environmental reporter for the Idaho Statesman in Boise and spent much of this past year on the road researching and writing a series on salmon, the Columbia River, and energy. He's also served as the lead researcher for a series of editorials calling for the removal of 4 dams on the lower Snake River. These assignments, and this was before this was really a popular topic or subject to look at. These assignments are just part of a rich career covering 4 decades. See, I didn't feel so bad about talking about my 4 decades when I knew that Rocky has also been at work that long. Not only in the United States, but also in other continents or on other continents. Rocky's body of work has produced several highly acclaimed books, including Scorched Earth, How the Fires of Yellowstone Changed America. The Wilderness Society recognized Rocky's work in 2016 with its Aldo Leopold Award, and before that, the National Conservation Achievement Award from the National Wildlife Federation. Please welcome Rocky Barker. So as we begin, and we're going to break this into 3 segments so that you can have an opportunity to pose some questions at various times, I'd like to begin, and we're going to break this into, as I said, a segment looking at where a dam has been removed, or dams have been removed and it's worked, where we're looking at that as a possibility, and then where do all of us fit in? Because I think it's critical as we walk forth from an evening such as tonight to know what can we do? Where are there some positive prospects? But what I'd like to do in beginning before we look at the Elwha is just turn to both Linda and Rocky and say, you have spent, and your newspapers have spent, a lot of time, a lot of thought, a lot of effort, a lot of money on covering this issue of salmon that is the center of this story. Why is that important to both of you?
So for me, it's definitely a story about who we are in the Northwest, and especially these days, it's a story about who are we going to be. I'm actually from the East Coast originally, and so when I first came out here, which was in 1992, a lot of people told me about the Northwest being different, that it had this green ethic, and I thought, we'll see. We'll see. You know, is it real, or did it just start 100, 150 years later out here? And I think it's fair to say we're still answering that question. Do we mean it? Are we going to be different? Or are we going to be a culture, a geography, a place that defines itself through not only humans, but the non-human world, the living world that is this beautiful, special place, the Pacific Northwest? The salmon describe that geography, where they are, we are, as we declare ourselves. So, for me, it's a story that just bit me hard and never let go, and I'm sure I'll be writing about salmon as long as I'm writing.
Rocky, a couple thoughts?
And I started, my Salmon Odyssey really began in 1990 when I did a series for the Idaho Falls Post-Register about endangered species and the Pacific Northwest. And it was for me a eye-opener, because I live, but I lived then even more so in the headwaters. Then I lived in Idaho Falls. And you know, this great place that we all share, we sometimes forget how we're all connected, and we're all connected by that water, and in that water are these fish. And I didn't really, when I first started, I'd been in Idaho for 5 years before I realized, my gosh, these fish are going away. And what's going on here? What are we doing? Why are we not doing something about this? And I was standing on a creek. It's called Marsh Creek. It's about 850 miles from the mouth of the Columbia. And I'm there in July of 1990. And in the river below me are these salmon spawning. They're at the end of this long, wonderful journey that they've made, first leaving these waters as young fish, yearlings, being carried out with the spring freshet, out down the middle fork of the Salmon, down the Salmon River, into the Snake, through the Columbia dams, all 8 of them, out to the estuary, and then they take a right turn at the mouth of the Columbia and head all the way up to Alaska before they turn around, came back 3 years later, and they're right in front of me doing their last great, why they started life in the first place. And I'm watching this, and I had just never seen anything like this in all the years that I've spent outdoors covering the environment. And I've been hooked since.
The issue of restoring salmon runs to what historically and prehistorically were the case brings up the question, can we get them at least in a direction back there? And that led to the issue of removing dams. This is not just theoretical, it's been done. And reading the coverage on that, it's worked. So Linda, I might turn to you first and say, when you first heard about this concept of removing dams on the Elwha, what was a general consensus and what was your reaction?
Well, people thought it was crazy. The number of people who thought this was, you know, a sane and sensible idea would have fit inside a Volkswagen Beetle, and they usually were inside Volkswagen Beetles. So, you know, it's one of those things that today it seems like, well, of course we did that, because after all, it did make so much sense. But in the beginning, it truly was regarded as a radical idea. Well, so, you know, I think that what has to be understood is that the tribes never wanted these dams, but of course they were not consulted because they were built so early in the history of the Northwest. And Bob, if you could start those slides, please. I have some slides to show you just to answer the question, well, how did all this get started on the Elwha River? We are a tale of two rivers tonight. I'm going to talk about the Elwha. It got started because people in Port Angeles, weren't setting out to do in a salmon run. Of course not. They were starting out hoping to develop industry in Port Angeles and do it with hydropower. That's Thomas Aldwell you see pictured, and he was the builder of the Elwha Dam back when someone could just go do that, no permits required. And in fact, the dam was built illegally. Even in the territorial legislature, it was illegal to impede salmon wherever they were wont to go. So that didn't stop him. Next slide, please. He continued on and formed a real estate company and quickly bought up all the land he would need for the reservoir behind the Elwha Dam. This is back in 1910. Next slide. And, construction gets cracking, and you can just roll through the next bunch of slides. And you take a look at what these men did back there in the woods, in the mountains. OSHA obviously was not on the job. Terrifying. They're swinging out on scaffolds over the river. They're taking their lives in their hands and building this thing. And what at that time, including in the editorials of the Seattle Times, was regarded as a noble undertaking, right? They were harnessing nature for people. They were going to create kilowatts with the river's power. And I just think that historical context is important to lay down. Number one, the complete ignoring of all that was already there, the native people, the native culture, the native fish, and the idea of forming a new booming industry. It was going to be pulp and paper in Port Angeles, and they were right. As soon as they created cheap hydropower, the pulp and paper industry got started. This, of course, was extraordinarily damaging to the tribe and its resources, to everyone who cared about fish in the river. And ultimately, it came time for those dams to have to live up to modern standards under the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. The license on the upper dam, the Glines Canyon Dam, was up, and the lower dam, of course, never had a license. And a very simple calculus, cost and benefits, was done. Do these dams still provide enough to enough people that they outweigh the incredible natural wealth of this landscape? The salmon that these dams built with no fish ladders had all but eliminated. And so the decision was made to take them down. And Steve Ringman, who's here tonight, a photographer I worked with at the Seattle Times on all of the stories we've done on the Elwha River, and I were there the day they shut the dams down. They literally threw the switch and turned off the electricity and began the process of taking the dams down. They literally walked away. So we're going to show you a video. It's a video that Steve shot, and you'll hear me doing some interviews, and it's a good overview of the story just to ground people who don't already know the story in it and be a jumping off point for what comes next. The Elwha River in the Olympic Mountains of Washington State is a special place. It offers secret worlds of quiet, intimate beauty, both on the surface and below, where the light is soft and the water clean, clear, and cold. Since 1910, the river has been blocked by 2 dams. Even though they're threatened with extinction, incredibly, the salmon still come back to the river every year, only to be blocked at the lower dam, built without fish passage. Built to generate hydroelectricity, the 2 dams powered the economy of Port Angeles and the Olympic Peninsula. Built in 1910 and 1927, they harkened back to another era, a grand industrial age in America when things were built of solid steel made right here and built to last. These dams were operated by hand, not remote control, and kept running by skilled workers who loved their craft.
I can feel this whole place breathing. I can know if something's going on and somebody else wouldn't notice it. I can You know, it's mostly the vibrations and smell. Actually, you want to know the truth.
The dams reflected an era of harvesting natural resources for economic development. Third-generation Bureau of Reclamation employee Kevin Yancey was the last to run the Elwha hydroelectric project before the generators were switched off for good in preparation for dam removal in June 2011.
You know what? What if your grandfather knew you were doing this? How would you explain it to him?
Oh, he'd roll over in his grave.
What would he say?
He would definitely not agree with what I'm doing. I would almost guarantee you that. If you were to take and look at how much work this took to put in, and we're just going to take it down, that's how they would see it. They would say, you're damning the work of all the people, you're condemning, and just all the hard work and maybe even lives and things else that it costs to do this. So that's why it can get emotional real quick.
You're gonna miss it. Sure, you don't even have to like it to miss it, you know. But I do like it here, yeah.
What do you like?
Huh?
What do you like?
The solitude, the river.
As dam removal has approached, scientists from a host of agencies and from all over the country have been watching. And for more than a decade, they have been working hard in the field to get ready for what is the largest dam removal project ever in North America. You name it, they've sampled it, measured it, tested it, from fish using the nearshore environment to the elk utilizing the habitat of the uplands. Learning anything in a big, wild river like the Elwha is hard, physical work, and it takes a lot of patience. It's very much the art of the possible, and gathering data is no easy task.
34, sir?
Yeah. Heck, shaped like a heart. 26.
One of the key questions scientists want to answer is how the food chain will be affected once salmon come back. They've sampled everything, even the bugs in the fish's stomach, to determine what the fish are eating.
Looks like a little cat. This is the larval stage of a caddis.
And so what we're trying to do now is get a baseline so you can see 10, 20 years later after dam removal, when they're restoring this ecosystem, if that marine-derived signature comes back into the birds, into the things that are feeding off of whatever's in the river.
Salmon are a keystone species of the Elwha ecosystem. They affect everything that lives there as they travel far into the upper reaches of the river, and animals drag their spawned-out carcasses deep into the forest. The nutrients their bodies carry are a potlatch, a feast, a gift, expected to help rebuild the entire watershed, not just the river.
No, I'm okay, bud.
If you don't get your coffee in the morning, this is a pretty good way to get yourself perky.
Using electroshockers, biologists can sample every fish in a stretch of river. The mild current briefly stuns the fish so they can be netted and sampled. Snorkel surveys require belly crawling through miles of side channels. Scientists try to record every single fish they see as they crawl and swim along.
Unidentified child 0 to 50 and rainbow 50 to 100.
But Elwha restoration isn't just a fish story. The shape and function of the river valley will change once the dams come out. These scientists are sounding the bottom of reservoirs behind the dam to discern the shape of some 24 million cubic yards of sediment trapped behind the dams. As the dams come out, the sediment will gradually be released, rebuilding the natural shape and function of the river.
This old tree wants to help us.
Thank you, tree. Scientists are also getting ready to restore not only the river, but the more than 800 acres that will be exposed once the dams come out and the reservoirs drain. An unprecedented replanting effort will be launched, using plants raised from seeds of native plants gathered by hand in the Elwha Valley. Elwha Dam removal is a $325 million experiment, the largest dam removal project ever, without precedent anywhere. No one knows how it will all come out. NOAA fisheries scientist George Pess is the leader of an interagency team of scientists doing baseline research on the Elwha.
I think from a recovery perspective, this is a unique opportunity because it's one of the few large-scale restoration acts we'll see in our professional lifetime. To open up this much habitat with one action is very unique.
As the dams start to come down, the world will be watching what is regarded as one of the best restoration opportunities anywhere. If it is successful, one day, all 5 species of salmon will thrive in this river, and the Elwha will run free through a watershed alive with native plants and abundant wildlife.
The experiment has occurred. How did the ecosystem respond, and did it extend beyond just salmon?
Kaboom! And that goes not only for the dams, but for the ecosystem. You know, the dams actually came down gradually, the upper dam especially, because it impounded so much sediment. So this was a process that went on over a couple of years. It wasn't like Condit, blow and go. I know how many times you've watched that footage, right? The thing that's been so exciting to watch, frankly, is the remarkable recovery of the river, and not only the river, but the entire ecosystem. This was always intended as a true watershed scale recovery with benefits not only to salmon, they were always the marquee animal, the one we all talk about, but honestly, to all the animals, and that is exactly what we're seeing in the Elwha. I go back and back to the Elwha, I haunt that place, and to stand in what was a reservoir, just 5 years later, there are trees growing over my head. This place that you didn't hear eagles, you didn't see kingfishers in the lower river. Today, people who've lived in the Elwha Valley for a long time will tell you they have never seen so many eagles in the lower river. Why is that? They're there because the eulachon are back. They're there because the forage fish are back. Even more incredibly, scientists who were doing all that baseline research that we talked about in the film, one of the things they looked at was birds. They were really interested in taking little teeny samples from their claws, their blood, their feathers, to see how much marine-derived nutrient did they see in their body. How much of that gift from the sea, from salmon eggs and carcasses, was in those birds. So, fast forward a couple years later, what do we see? We see a big boost already in those marine-derived nutrients in those birds. Dippers, that lovely aquatic songbird, you know the one that goes like this. Dippers are already bearing double clutches. They used to leave the Elwha. They don't even leave anymore. They don't even migrate. They stick around. And why not? Because they can lift these little coho eggs to their bills like a glass of Merlot. So it is spectacular, and if you haven't been out there, you must go. You live in the backyard of the world's largest dam removal project, and it is working. Has it been perfect? No. Have there been some bloopers, sure, we'll come back to that. But never lose sight of what has been accomplished and is being accomplished. This is going to be an ongoing transformation. We in our lifetime will never see the full thing, of course, but the fish are coming back, the birds are booming, even the little mice are getting in on the act. They're starting to colonize those big fat stacks of wood that now get to migrate down the river and rebuild the channel like it was always supposed to. And all that sediment that was stuck behind the dams, I invite you to Washington's newest beach. It's at the mouth of the Elwha River.
And we'd invite you, do we have a couple of questions? We're going to pause periodically for some time, but does anybody have a question relating to what we've just been discussing, what Linda has been discussing? If so, just raise your hand.
Right, so the question was, how are the numbers looking? I will tell you that you're going to be disappointed this year. Here's what the curve looks like. And then back up. The reason for this is because the fish coming back this year and for the next couple of years went out during the worst time, right? So they went out when the river was basically moving mud. Okay, fine. It'll be all right. They're going to come back. So there was also an issue with the upper dam. There was a rock fall. It impeded the passage. It wasn't pitch perfect. They went back. They did some more work. Still checking on whether things are the way they're supposed to be. So there was some disappointment about fish getting into the upper watershed at first. It got much better after some truly He-Man rock blasting. So don't freak out when you see this. It's to be expected. It will get better.
I see a question right down here.
I knew that was going to happen. I love Seattle. Okay, so there was a big, fat, hairy lawsuit about this, and it was filed the very day people showed up for the big party in Port Angeles to celebrate dam removal. Isn't that just us? That's how we roll. So, that lawsuit has been decided, and it was decided that the effort to have a hatchery to enhance the supplementation of the river with hatchery fish, that's been decided as okay. So the courts have ruled on that. There is a hatchery, it's a brand new hatchery, but there's also a promise, and here's how it goes. The promise is that targets, absolute numerical targets, are part of the recovery plan. They're on paper, you can read them, you can be sure I'll be reading them. And if those targets are met, the hatchery is supposed to be unplugged. So here's your job, because it's also my job too, which is to keep track. Right? As time goes on, as the year goes by, are we keeping our promise to ourselves? Is recovery successful? Are the fish coming back? And do what we promised, which is adaptive management. There were two reasons for the hatchery. One was there was so much concern about actually losing some of these endangered fish because the numbers were so teeny. Once you flooded the river with sediment, it seemed like a smart thing to have some at the hatchery, so you wouldn't actually lose stock while you're trying to save them. The other reason was because the tribe, which had already been waiting to be able to have a viable fishery again, did not want to wait as long as it was going to take for a fully natural recovery, which was going to be at least 20 years.
Perhaps one more question before we move to section 2, yes.
So the question is there a comparative analysis underway about those two dam removals? Because they were so different. Condit was blow and go. Obviously very different scene in the Elwha. I'm sure that's going on. I can just feel it, can't you? All those papers getting written right now in scientific agencies. I certainly hope so, because there is a lot to learn. By the way, no hatchery in that dam removal project, so another reason to be interested. These are very different situations, and I guess if I were to say one thing tonight, it's place by place, river by river, scene by scene. I mean, the work for the region is to look at every one of these situations and figure out what is the situation. With Condit, interestingly, this was a completely privately funded dam removal. It was done by PacifiCorp. Reason? They didn't want to spend the money to try to bring their deadbeat dam up to modern standards. It was built at about the same time as the Elwha. It had fish passage originally, failed very early on, didn't have fish passage for most of its career. And the company made the simple business decision to pull the plug, and pull it they did, literally.
Well, let's turn now from the Elwha to the Snake, with the promise we will have more time for questions and answers, where removal is on the table, but not yet a reality. And Rocky, I'd ask you to first put this in a bit of a historical context for us, if you would. You played a key role in providing research and guidance to that first set of some very highly influential Idaho Statesman editorials 20 years ago. Can you give us a sense of what was going on then? What led up to that?
22 years ago, my editor, very conservative, asked me to spend 30 days examining the issue of whether taking out the 4 lower Snake dams in Washington, your state, would be good for my state, Idaho. He didn't look at the whole region. He simply looked at the issue, wanted me to look at the issue from the aspect of Idaho's interest. And I spent those 30 days. We came up with, I wrote a long memo for him, and then from that memo, my colleague Susan Whaley wrote this series of editorials that were in this reprint that concluded it would be better for Idaho and likely the region if we removed those dams, because it was the only way that we could use less of Idaho's irrigation water to get the salmon downriver, which was the most important issue for our Idaho politicians. Second, it was the fastest, best, most effective way to restore salmon that spawn in Idaho. We have 22 million acres of some of the best habitat in the whole Columbia Basin. And we didn't need habitat restoration work. We didn't need a whole lot of other things. We simply needed to get these fish to the ocean. And with 8 dams in between, we used Idaho Fish and Game's own data and others, and concluded that the easiest and cheapest and best way to do this was to take out those 4 dams. Well, when we did this, nobody was really talking about it. I think there was a piano tuner in Boise who had been trying to make hay with it. But when we did this, it was its own boom. It was quite amazing to see, because it came in 1997, the same year that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission had decided that the Edwards Dam on the Kennebec River in Maine had to go. And that was the first big dam in the country that was being ordered removed. And in July, Bruce Babbitt and the head of American Rivers both said in a column I wrote that that series that my paper wrote was one of the beginnings of the river restoration movement. Combined with the Edwards Dam, since then 600, more than 600, many more I think, dams have been removed nationwide. And the Elwha's the biggest, but there's been a lot of dam removals.
What I might ask is, Linda brought up the question of the absolute lack of consultation with the affected tribes on the Elwha when the dam went in, the change that we've seen since then. What would be the situation in terms of tribes in and around the Snake? What is the tribal context that you've seen there?
Well, this whole discussion in the Columbian Snake, we wouldn't really even be having it if it wasn't for the tribes. It wasn't the tribes, it was individual tribal fishermen who went out and exercised their rights in the 70s and 80s, getting arrested, particularly in Idaho. I mentioned the 80s, but it was the 70s on the Columbia River. These guys went out and they fished when nobody wanted it. And of course up here, Billy Frank's up here in the Puget Sound. These people, we wouldn't be doing this. We wouldn't be sitting in this room had they not done that, because they forced the rest of us to look to the river. they forced the rest of us to quit taking our rivers and our salmon for granted. But then it all started to form into this whole issue about our electrical system. And what I really learned this time around, I guess what I was saying is, I got this chance this time to do it about the whole region. My bosses said, go back out there and see what's going on. So I started in May, and I followed the salmon that were swimming back to Idaho, up the Columbia, and I met with all of these folks. And some of the most important and interesting people I met with were some of the tribal voices. And
you have a video, I think.
I've got a video that kind of shows a little bit of what they have to say.
When you look at the habitat in Idaho, you are talking about a 4- or 5-star quality hotel sitting there in central Idaho, waiting for fish to come back. Instead, they get stopped at these dams. We have a basic math problem on our hands.
But there's more fish in the river. You will never, ever meet the objective of recovery for the 13 listed stocks. It simply mathematically will never happen.
All of the stocks are declining. Some of them look a little better, and the reason they look a little better is because we're pumping out a bazillion hatchery fish to mask the decline of the native fish.
So a lot of people think we could have dams and fish both. Well, I think we're seeing that maybe not.
It all is interconnected. We take that position for our salmon. Our salmon can't survive without the water. And then I look at, yeah, maybe this does put us against, the cattle industry and the agricultural society.
I think we're going to be right back to where we were 20 years ago. The cheapest thing to do would be buy us out. And that's only short term, because now you look at this economy, you're going to lose a lot of sales tax, you're going to lose good jobs that will go away. We have a lot of young people. What are they going to do? Where are they going to go to work? It's no longer that simple.
The second problem is that we created expectations for people and communities. We built a whole series of dams, and we created a whole series of constituencies behind that depend on those dams.
I see a future for those dams. They were built for a reason. As long as they're useful and providing enough power to light the city of Seattle for an entire year, that status quo right now is a place where we could live with.
What's happened over the past 20 years is we haven't left any room for dialogue. The only way that the salmon advocates get their voices heard are by going to court.
Climate change has had a drastic impact on our way of life, just living within the landscape. I have many fears about what that will be for my unborn great-grandchildren, and so it has to be a reality now.
People aren't so afraid of dam removal anymore. We have yet to have an unsuccessful dam removal that has not created benefits for the community.
So we're in this adversarial relationship with people who want to maintain their socioeconomic status quo. We are winning in court. We have won in court 5 times, but we keep winning in court and we keep losing in the river.
And if we're also going to be a society that's not going to honor our treaties that we made with the tribes, I don't think that reflects very well on us either.
If there was a reason for optimism in the past, climate change takes that optimism away. Without action, these fish won't slide into extinction. They will run into oblivion.
Rocky, I suspect we're going to be delving into this in the question and answer period as well, but I think we also have to look at the fact that a lot of people here are most familiar with the Elwha, the sort of the situation, all the factors surrounding the Elwha and those surrounding the Snake are very different. Could you give us a sense of perspective as to how those differ and why that's important in terms of strategies to get those dams out?
That's right. The 4 lower Snake dams continue to produce a lot of power, and we can't dismiss the importance that they've been. The difference is it's not as important as when this series of editorials was written 20 years ago for the energy. Now, that doesn't mean it isn't still important, but there are a whole lot of other sources of energy in this region now, and we have a surplus. What those 4 dams are important for short-term peaking. When we need a lot of power in the region, they're run-of-the-river dams. They don't have a reservoir behind them, so they can only run for about 2 to maybe 16 hours, and that's really stretching it. So that, you know, as batteries, they aren't very good batteries. And that's really the thing that is happening here. We are going through that's the other thing I really learned this trip. We're going through an amazing transition in our electric industry, not just the Bonneville Power Administration, which is so critical to our region, but also all of our utilities. And it's the same, I know what this kind of digital transition's about because I'm in the newspaper business. And we have about 1/3 of the staff we had in 2008, just in 10 years. And that's because our newspaper advertising is no longer where people spend their money. Businesses spend their money on digital advertising. And so I have to get digital readers. And that is it's a completely new business model for my company. Well, Bonneville Power is facing the exact same issue. Right now, the power from those dams just by itself is still, can compete on the market, but Bonneville has a whole lot of other debt tied to this, and its Fish and Wildlife Program. We're still paying off the whoops debt from the reactors in the early 1980s. We're still paying that. And so you have that on top of a very, a growing, it's been a very expensive Fish and Wildlife Program. And from my standpoint, that Fish and Wildlife Program has been, over the last, since 2008, since we started this round of work on the dams, we have really made great progress. Bonneville and the Corps should take pride. I mean, the system is probably the best system in the world for getting salmon up and down through dams. It's just not enough. It's just not enough.
And that brings to mind the fact that there are different voices here, and I think you've got a wonderful video piece that speaks to that.
Usually you can stand right on there and catch a fish and have firm footing and be comfortable with it, but now that water's moving so fast over the top of that rock that he's not stable enough to sit on it. Salmon are so powerful in that they give themselves to us in a way that no other animal does. They're the only animals that don't see their children. And I heard that from an elder, and you know, they give themselves up for you and us. You know, it made me think about the salmon in my Tamina. The treaties have done good for everybody, not just the Nez Perce. The treaties have helped us keep the salmon coming back in ways and more opportunities there to not only the Indian but the non-Indian.
It's one of our first foods, and it's a celebration of being able to, I don't know, to survive and trade, and you know, there's so many things that go with it. Nice. We can sell the shad, but the salmon are subsistence only right now. So they're going in our freezer or whatever we decide to do for the winter. I do the gill netting with Dad every year. It gets cold, 0 degrees. And this river's, she's not very forgiving.
You guys gonna walk down, Ralph?
You want to make our guess?
See, these guys are biting at the bit, wanting to go yesterday. So these guys came to the camp and got to make their own stuff, and they know the best chance for them will be to have a gaff and put a hook on it and go start hitting the lower holes. Usually there's 10,000 hooks from Lower Granite to here where that's an obstacle itself besides, the onslaught that they face getting here with, predators to different things on the Columbia, and then they got the dams. And if that fish does not come back, then everybody feels that impact, and that's what happened with this fishing season.
Oh, well, we got one. Yippee! When I'm away from the river for too long, it's weird. It is. It's a lot of work, but it's soothing to the soul for sure. It's definitely home, and I love the fact that I can do it with my family. My daughter's down there. My 6-year-old son loves to do it. It's in our blood for sure. For sure, it's in our blood.
Well, I have to tell you, I have not heard about the 50-year contract, but I will tell you that the Corps of Engineers has made it absolutely clear that they are not going to let those dams come down until Congress tells them to. That is their position, and there are competing legal views on whether there are other ways to do that, but the Corps, as opposed to Bonneville Power, has been very clear about that issue. They want it. It's going to be Congress that's going to have to do that. So that means the one good thing about that's a political process they're asking for. So that means talking to your political leaders here in Washington and in Idaho, and in Oregon, and Montana.
Question over here.
So, if I understand your question right, does Bonneville pay California to take the surplus power in the spring? Bonneville told me this year that is not true. Now, I'm not certain that it wasn't true about 20 years ago, certainly around 2001. I know that they have paid people in the past, but they say they're not doing that now.
Question in the back, please.
The question was, what are the changes that I saw when I spent my 6 months going up and down the river? What are the changes particularly in the use on the 4 lower snake dams? Well, first, today there's 17 farmers who irrigate out of it. That's about the same amount as irrigated out of it back in 20 years ago. But today they are among the last high lift pumpers left on the entire Columbia system. Over in Idaho, we bought out all of our high lift pumpers because it no longer was economic. So that's one thing is that, but those guys, and you saw Ron Ryman, the late Ron Ryman, he died right after that interview. They still want to keep farming, and I think they can in whatever happens out of this, especially the guy across the river, Brochi, Ralph Brochi, who he doesn't care about the money, he just cares about his workers on his beautiful orchards. But it's the wheat farmers that's really have changed. There's only, most of your Washington wheat farmers are now, and not just wheat farmers, they're now grain farmers. They're raising lentils, they're raising chickpeas, and they're not shipping them they can't ship them on the river. They ship them on the expanded rail systems that they have financed themselves. And so the Idaho wheat farmers, not all of them, only this small group, still gets about $1 a bushel savings by using that shipping. So it's critical to them, but it's not a very big number. It's something like $7 million, which is something we could probably just pay them the $7 million. So that's another, so the bottom line is the river itself no longer produces goods and services as much as it did 20 years ago, and the power is not worth as much money, and Bonneville has this imperative to go through a transition of which its hydro dams are only a part of, and a much smaller part of, and these have always been the 4 dams that were the least valuable to them. So that's, I like to make the point that I'm a reporter. I'm not telling you we got to do this, but I also, we've had the last 10 years, 15 years, 20, almost 20 years of on and off, but pretty darn good ocean conditions. And so we filled the river with hatchery fish, which, by the way, I might add, have been feeding the orcas as well. And so that's one good thing those hatchery fish were doing. But what I wanted to say, I'm not saying we need to take those 4 dams out, but it's, as you heard Chris Wood say, now the ocean's turned, and we're facing some really dire situation, even in that great habitat, 4-star hotel of habitat we have. And so it's, we don't have a lot of time anymore.
I think it's obvious that the depth and the breadth of these issues is such that there's no way we could do more than scratch the surface in the hour and a half we have allotted. We will have some more time for questions, but in the interest of time and to address some of the other issues that are coming up, we have at least a foundation of the Elwha experience, the issues involved in the question of removing the snake dams. So let's broaden our perspective now, and I would pose this question to both you, Rocky and Linda, and that is, you both have very definite ideas of what ultimately is at the root of the concept of who we are, what this region is, and why that's central to that. Could you share your thoughts on that?
I want to go back to the orca since they just came up. I mean, to me, when I think of an animal that is the face of what we're talking about tonight, it's actually that animal. Because, I mean, here you have this really rather sad situation of a critically endangered animal, the southern resident orca whale, down to only 76 animals. This is a JKNL pod, and they are absolutely genetically unique, and they're also culturally unique. In their families, which are matriarchal, Chinook salmon are what they eat. That's what they prefer. They will eat other fish. They'll take a coho, even a lingcod now and then, but mostly it's Chinook salmon that they want. And the sad thing that we're watching is that they are starving. They cannot get enough to eat. Why is that? Well, that's because in all of the waters that they travel to eat, whether they're in the Puget Sound or they're at the outer coast or in the Straits, the salmon they need are a threatened species. So you have this perfect tableau of an endangered animal depending on a threatened animal for its main food. They don't eat seals. They don't eat marine mammals. We look at the transient orca whales that do eat marine mammals. They're doing great. They're pumping out a baby every 2 years. You know, those whale watch cruises, that money's coming from the transient orcas, not the locals. The locals really actually aren't coming around as much as they used to. They were only in the Puget Sound area around the San Juan Islands 22 days last summer. You used to see them every day in the summer. So my point is that if we think about where we're at now, there's the orca whale. To me, it is a symbol of the problem. And we are in a time of climate change. All of the margin that we had in terms of the conditions in these rivers is slipping away. You look at those temperatures in the reservoirs these last couple of summers, they're hitting 70 degrees. Salmon are cold water animals. During the drought of 2015, you had so many sockeye dying in the mainstream river, they never even had the chance to try to make it back to Idaho. So that's where we are. And you also have to remember, as we talk about, well, Congress is going to make the decision. Actually, we still have 3 branches of government, and this issue is squarely in the judiciary. For the 5th time, the biological opinion under which these rivers are run by the federal family has been drop-kicked by a federal judge, and they've been told to do it over. And so here we go again, but it's different this time, and it's different for 2 reasons. The reason for that is they've been instructed at the agencies to re-rack a new EIS, new science, fresh look, everything on the table. That includes 2 things, dam removal and climate change. So we're in this process. It's going to go on for several years, and that's where you come in, because it is a public process, and it's absolutely your job to know where this is in the courts and to stay involved.
Excellent, Linda.
So, Rocky, I would toss that to you, and also you've brought up the idea in looking at the overall issues, the concept of what you've called a resilient society. So comment on both what Linda said and also your own thoughts.
You know, Bill is right. These aren't Idaho's fish. These are all of our fish. This is the region's fish. This is, you know, these fish go all the way, our steelhead go all the way to Asia. And they fill up people's, they touch people's lives all over. And we need to have the ecosystems in which they depend, ecosystems like Linda described on the Elwha, that are linked all the way to Asia, protected, linked, and resilient, and so that they can stand what's coming with climate change. We just saw in 2014 through 2016 this blob out in the ocean that had a dramatic impact on all of our fish. We are now going through the cyclical conditions that are not good for the Columbia and snake fish. And we're gonna see this downturn continue for a couple of years. And so we're gonna have to all do, we need resilient ecology. We need the ecosystems resilient, but our communities and our region, which in a sense is represented by the Bonneville Power Administration, because Bonneville, you know, set up by Roosevelt to, you know, make our region grow, you know, has succeeded wonderfully up to now, but it's going to have to completely transform if it's going to survive the next 10 to 15 years. So we all going to have to work together to protect the things we value in this region. And we have to really become a region again. And I think it's really critical that, we need our leaders to do that. We need to demand it, and we need to get ourselves through this transition, both of the climatic transition and, you know, the economic transition.
I think you bring up climate change and climate science, and obviously that has a great deal of engagement for me. One of the interesting bits of research I read recently was if you consider if you were in an office and you noticed more paper ending up in the wastebasket than you did in the out file, you'd begin to wonder what was going on. A very similar situation happened with climate scientists who began to notice there were a lot of observation stations, particularly over the more northern latitudes, that were being tossed out by computer models. And the reason was that their observations were well off the range of what they generally expected. They began to check these with other means of observing and verifying those temperatures, and they began to realize there was nothing wrong with those observations. There was something that was far in excess of anything that had been projected, and they're beginning to reform and reformulate those computer models right now, and that's exactly what both of you have been talking that we're going to be facing. I think a major problem in any environmental issue is the idea, the challenge of connecting disconnected groups, people that have very different conceptions of things. We see it with the quote-unquote issue of fake news. We see it with people getting vastly different information, more often from social media than considerably researched articles such as both of you do. How do we connect people on this?
Telling the truth really helps. It's a great place to start, anyway. I have faith in nature, a lot of faith in nature. You know, one of the things I love about covering salmon and that whole issue, you can count fish, and they don't lie. There are more of them or there aren't. They're here or they aren't. I'll tell you a story. I was talking to some scientists a couple weeks ago. They went out for their annual trawl survey off the Washington coast. This is something they've done every year for 30 years. Just good old basic science. Go out there with a net, drag it through the water, and see what you find. You know what they were looking for? They were looking for the outmigrating juvenile Chinook from the Columbia River. And they've done this every year for 30 years. So they go out this last spring. They drag their trawl net through the water, and you know what? They thought maybe they had a hole in the net. There was nothing in it. It was empty. They were really worried by that. They couldn't imagine what was going on. So they headed north a little further up Washington coast. Okay, they started catching things, the wrong things. Fish that aren't supposed to be here. Warm water fish. Fish still here. So the blob is gone, but the fish that arrived with it are still here. It went on. They got more worried because what they began to see was an ocean that is really resetting to a different regime. So I wrote that story, and I'm going to keep writing more of those stories because I think nature tells the truth. Nature is speaking loud and clear, and what we need to do is listen. I don't worry about nature. Nature's going to talk. What I wonder is if we will hear her testimony.
Very good. Very true. And I like Linda, I think part of our challenge in this region is I don't think we have trusted nature enough. We have felt like we always had to do something extra to help. We always were looking for a technological fix. And a lot of times it's not about a technological fix. These are incredible animals. They, steelhead spawn all the way south in San Clemente Creek in California. So yes, climate change is really bad. And it's going to be, and all of this stuff is really bad, but these salmon, they are amazing if we give them the places and the ecosystems and the habitat to live and the way to get there. And that's possible for us. Over the next 50 years, probably the conditions that they have in the Sacramento, we're going to be facing here. And the problem with the Sacramento is there isn't any habitat left. There isn't any water left. Well, we've still got water and we still got habitat. We got to make some hard decisions about what we're going to do with it. That's where we're at.
One question, and then we're going to open it up to questions to all of you, but I'd say we have a group of very motivated and dedicated people out in the audience here, representing many different groups that have been doing a lot of hard work, heavy lifting on that. What would both of you suggest that they could best do to address the problems that you've seen, that you've reported on?
Keep at it. Don't go away. Story's far from over.
Well, one place to start is go onto YouTube and watch the TED Talk by the head of the Bonneville Power Administration, a guy named Elliot Mainzer. Now, Elliot Mainzer is in this amazing role through this EIS of having to decide what to do about those 4 lower snake dams, how to get his agency and institution through this transition. He knows how to do it. Will he trust nature? And you can make him listen, and then you've got to tell your political leaders to back him up if he makes the right choice. If he doesn't, well, they need to tell him to make the right choice.
I can't be accused, because I'm no longer doing active media work anymore, of playing to my own interest, but I would say there's a definite key, and that is staying informed. And that means reading the well-researched, well-thought-out work of both Linda and Rocky, as opposed to the stuff you pick up on social media and the soundbite and that sort of thing. So I'd say staying informed and acting on that is a key element too.
Oh!